Welcome to VMware View Administration Training by TrainSignal. This is the first lesson, Getting Started with VMware View Administration Training. I'll be your instructor through this series, so let's talk a little bit about me first. This is me. I'm Brian Knutson. I can be found on Twitter at bknutson. In this first slide, I'm going to try and show you why you should spend some time listening to me talk about VMware View. Let's start with my certifications. I've attained almost all of VMware certifications to date, including all three versions of the VCP, the VCAP DCA and VCAP DCD products. I also have a VTSP, which stands for VMware Technical Sales Professional, which is a partner certification for technical folks like myself. I've also attained the VCA DT and VCP DT, the first two of VMware's View certifications. I also have an MCITP Enterprise Administration for Microsoft Server 2008 and the Master ASE in High Availability and Clustering Solutions from HP. Those are the main technologies I deal with in my day-to-day job. But do all those letters really mean anything to you? Probably not. So let's talk about my qualifications. I started working with VMware technologies back in 2004, specifically with ESX 2.5. Back then I worked for a customer of VMware, and one of my roles as the main VMware administrator was coming up with other uses of the virtual environment so that we could extend our value of that infrastructure that we built. One of those ideas that we came up with was virtualizing our Windows XP desktops inside of a virtual machine. This was before VMware ever even had a product for VDI, let alone having coined VDI as a buzzword. And it worked real well. Once I started working for a partner, my first project was implementing VMware VDM, which is the predecessor to the VMware View product that we'll be talking about in this lesson. A few additional accomplishments I have include obtaining the VMware vExpert Award for 2009 and 2010, which are the only 2 years they've been awarded at the time of this recording. I've also been invited several times to sit on VMware's Partner Technical Advisory Board, which is made up of the top partners in the country, where we get to talk directly to the VMware product managers and engineers about their product roadmaps and future products that they're planning on making. So enough about me. Let's talk about this video series. The main purpose of this series is to provide you knowledge of VMware View so that you can successfully implement it and manage it for your own environment. The way I've structured these lessons is essentially the same way that I deal with implementations with customers. I like to guide the customers through the installation and configuration of View, explaining each of the terms and settings along the way. And most of the time that will generate conversation around why we would set a setting one way as opposed to another. I've tried to cover all those conversations in this video series. A secondary purpose of the series is to help prepare you for the VMware Certified Associate Desktop Certification, or VCA-DT. By going through this entire video series, you'll hit on all the different objectives to the VCA-DT certification, which we'll talk more about in a lesson dedicated to that certification. As we talk about all these topics, I'll try and place these into real-world scenarios. I did this by creating a fictitious company that's planning on implementing VMware View, so that I can talk about why we would implement things in certain scenarios, and show this through a demo environment. At the end of each lesson, I'll provide you additional resources that you can use to further your knowledge, and they can also be used as reference material while implementing your infrastructure. Next, let's talk about what a virtual desktop infrastructure is. First and foremost, it is a major shift in the way desktops are managed. Many of the ideas that have been used to manage desktops traditionally will apply, but just as often you're going to need to throw away some of your preconceived notions of what a desktop truly is. The idea with a virtual desktop infrastructure is to separate all the pieces that make up a desktop that normally are glued together and can't be separated on a physical desktop. Things like the applications, the user's profile, the user's data, the hardware, and the operating system itself should all be completely abstracted apart from one another so that they can dynamically be put together when the user needs to access their desktop. This requires a very flexible and self-served infrastructure This will require a high level of automation to minimize the amount of input that the IT department will need to put into it on a connection-by-connection basis. All this will build up individual desktops for each user that can then be centralized in the data center so that they can be easily accessed from just about anywhere, be secured a lot better than you can with physical desktops and laptops, and can be much easier to back up and recover in a disaster. And yes, many of these tenants are the same as a cloud infrastructure, and I oftentimes compare View to a desktop cloud or a desktop as a service offering. VDI has many things in common with traditional server-based computing. All the desktops are primarily stored in the data center and executed on servers in the data center, rather than on the individual client devices. It also provides a consistent end-user experience, no matter which device or location they may be in. One major difference VDI has from traditional server-based computing infrastructures is the ability to segregate the operating systems from one user to the next. Looking at a traditional terminal services model, they all share one operating system, so if one user crashes the OS, all the other users on that server will also lose their operating system. In a VDI, the loss of one operating system affects only a single user. All other users are running their own independent operating system. So as we get into these lessons, what do I expect you to already know? First, you need to have at least a basic understanding of what makes up a virtual machine and how a virtual machine actually works. And being able to navigate the vSphere client will be very useful to you. You'll also want to know the basics of Active Directory. You don't need to know how to manage it, just how it works, and more specifically, how user and computer accounts are created and used, and how to create group policies and apply them properly to desktops and users. A basic understanding of networking is useful as well. Understanding MAC addresses, IP addresses, and ports in both TCP and UDP protocols will allow these lessons to make a bit more sense to you. Having managed a Windows desktop environment will be very useful to you as well, since really VDI is just changing the way that these desktop operating systems are managed and presented to the end user. But at the core, knowing how Windows works is the most important thing. So here's what we're going to talk about in this series. We'll talk about the different components that View has and how they're licensed. We'll cover how to install View, and once View is installed, we'll talk about how to configure pools and how to maintain them. We'll talk about the user profile and the user data, which are topics that must be considered at the beginning of the project, and unfortunately don't always get discussed early enough in the project. We'll also talk about some specific features within VMware View, including View Local Mode, which allows an end user to download their virtual desktop onto their device and execute it on that local device. Kiosk Mode, which allows a client device to automatically connect without any user input and provide a kiosk-like interface. One important and oftentimes difficult topic in any server-based computing platform is the topic of how to use printers. We'll discuss several different ways in which you can manage and map printers within a View infrastructure. After that, we'll talk about FinApp, which is VMware's application virtualization technology for abstracting the applications away from the operating system. Specifically, we'll talk about how to create a FinApp package and how to deploy it to our desktops. Finally, we'll talk about two very important topics for the VCA DT certification, the monitoring and troubleshooting topics. So, let's get started. But before we do that, let's talk about some tips on how to best use this video series. The lessons in this series can be viewed in any order. You can watch them straight through to learn how to build a View infrastructure from the ground up. Or you can jump directly to topics that are most interesting to you to either enhance your knowledge of View that you already have, or to help you study for the certification exam. But do know that the lessons generally are going to build on one another, so that something we do in one lesson will be something we may utilize in the second lesson. A good example of this is the FinApp lessons, where in one lesson we're going to create a package, and then in the second lesson we'll deploy that application. One of our first lessons will be talking about the core scenario. It's important to watch this before you watch any other lessons, because it's the framework that I'll use for providing real-world examples for our fictitious company. On top of this, all the labs that I perform for each lesson will be conducted in the context of this fictitious company. But I do encourage you to pause and consider your own environment and how these lessons will apply to them and how you may be similar or different from this fictitious company. Finally, you may have questions or need clarifications about some of these topics. First, I'd recommend reviewing the supporting resources that I provide at the end of the lesson. More often than not, these are links to VMware documentation for view, and will contain a lot of information and step-by-step instructions on how to do different pieces of the View infrastructure. Next, I would engage the community. VMware's created a great forum section on their website, where a lot of your questions may already be answered, and if they're not, it's easy to post a question up there and have real-world experts answer those questions. A lot of this knowledge has bled over to blogs and Twitter as well. So using Google to search for more information, of course, is always a great avenue, as well as following and interacting with people on Twitter who do view infrastructures, including myself. Next, provide feedback. At the very end of the Next Steps lesson, I provide you with many different avenues in which you can contact TrainSignal to provide us feedback, both what you liked and what you didn't like, or to simply ask questions about the content. Finally, I encourage you to just ask. You can ask me on Twitter, which is going to be the easiest way for you to contact me, and I will definitely try and respond to you as quickly as I can. But also ask your team at VMware. Within each region of VMware's territories, there are View specialists that can be brought in to answer very specific questions. You can also ask your local community at VMware user groups or at special events put on by VMware or their partners. So that's what you need to know to make the most out of this video training series. And I look forward to working with you through the rest of these lessons.